So I'm very glad to welcome here Niklas Nylund. Niklas Nylund is a researcher working at the Suomen Pelimuseum, or Pelimuseo, the Finnish Museum of Games that is here in Tampere, and that we will be visiting on Friday. So hopefully many of the beautiful things that he will show us, you can also see them in person at the end of the conference. Niklas also has a PhD entitled Game Heritage, Digital Games in Museum Collections and Exhibitions, which dealt with digital games from a heritage perspective. And his research interests include games and their history, players and play communities, as well as the societal values and valutations attached to them. So thank you very much, Niklas, for being here. I really look forward to listen to your keynote presentation.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. It's a privilege, it's a pleasure. I'm going to be talking about board games and Finnish board games. My title is 160 Years of Finnish Games, although I will probably go a little bit even further into history. But I'm hoping the national perspective will give some new insight into what happens in board games. As introduced, I work at the Finnish Museum of Games as a researcher, as a museum practitioner. I'm making exhibitions, taking care of the collections, sort of working with that. I have quite a long history already as a museum practitioner from over 10 years ago, and I've been building permanent exhibitions for the Media Museum, for the Postal Museum, for the Game Museum here in Tampere. And the latest, bigger project I did was an exhibition called Fantastic Failure, dealing with the Nokia N-Gage gaming phone, which was a fantastic failure. Our museum is located here in Tampere, just a kilometer from here, and you will go in there on Friday. It's a museum dealing primarily with video games, digital games, but it also includes analog games of different types. And you could say that roughly 14% could be said to be board games in the permanent exhibition. Some images from them. But we have lots more in the collections. And many Finnish museums have also board games in their collections. And especially the National Library has a lot of board games. In addition to a permanent exhibition, we also are making small changing exhibitions, and some of these have been dealing with board games. The Kalevala games a couple of years ago was dealing both with board games and video games. An exhibition called Old Board Game Treasures had 7 games from the collections of the National Library. And I guess the latest project, Imaginary Geography, dealt also quite a lot with board games. There's a Finnish booklet you can download from the link. I didn't put up a QR code, sorry, but I've also had that at the end of the slides that you can look at. And it looks at maps and also board games from different perspectives. Sort of from a museum perspective, board games are kind of tricky because we don't really know how many board games have been published in Finland. We have lists from the National Library, but board games weren't seen as part of the legal deposit for a long while. So publishers didn't send their board games there. The National Library has later been active in acquiring them, but they don't have a complete list, as they do with, for example, books published in Finland. So we don't really know what kind of, or how many have been preserved in collections, how big the percentage is. We can, I guess, make some estimates. As I said, at the Finnish Museum of Games, we had about 200 games. The National Library has thousands in their collection. Many museums have games, many collectors have games, and I guess an estimate would be there's been at least thousands, maybe even more, published in Finland throughout the years. And as we've heard already during the colloquium, sort of sources are tricky. We need to do mostly material object research if we want to understand them. Sometimes we can find photographs of play, and I'll be showing those as well here. You might find some news items from newspapers dealing with the games, but it's kind of rare. Maybe there are some publisher catalogs we can look at, maybe oral histories, and even archaeological finds in some cases. So you really need to piece all that information together. What makes it a bit trickier is that the published games rarely have a publication year, rarely mention designers, illustrators, or anything like that. I guess today I'll try to dig into these two topics, what kind of games have been published and played in Finland throughout the years, and how it has changed. I'll be looking at games in a roughly chronological order, but also making some thematic pairings, dealing with various topics. And I'll be mostly looking at commercially published games. And of course, we know that there exist also other games that were never published, or games from archaeological finds. Those are not my main concern today. And these will be mostly thematic games, not abstract strategy games. Yes. The sources are our own collections, as well as mostly the National Library collections. And you will find quite many games in the National Library collection if you go to the link, the bottom link, the Doria link. I will also have that in the end of the presentation. And I should have put up a QR code, but still, maybe you will be able to find them. But as we've already heard, games seem to be everywhere. And if you look at the archaeological and ethnographic record, you will find them. But you kind of need to know where to look. And sometimes these games have also been misunderstood in the past, and which is fairly easy to do, because even today it's in some cases quite difficult to know whether a game is purely a game or if it's somehow related to religious practice or dealing with that sort of future. But here's a couple of examples from Finland. There's Turku, which is the oldest city in Finland, has quite a lot of archaeological finds. There's dice, there's chess pieces, tafel games, and also babka game pieces. And babka is actually a Karelian game, and babka is a Karelian name for a game that was apparently played in a lot of places in Europe. And it's a game. It's in the lower picture where you're throwing cow bones. So many of those have been found in Turku archaeological digs, and there's been research into how this is apparently cases where these were used for playing babka. We also know of a game of the Skoltsami, a game called Pasture. The Skoltsami is a very, very small cultural and linguistic group with only about 1,500 Skoltsami in Finland, some more in Russia, I guess also in Norway some, but it's still a very small cultural group. And you can see the play of Pasture in the image above. And this image was taken on a sort of ethnographic tour of Lapland. And as we heard yesterday from Otis' keynote, sort of Sami culture has been quite well researched over the years, and the research also touches on games. This is also a game played with bones, reindeer bones. And it's a game where you throw the bones, and depending on how they land on the playing surface, you will either interpret those as reindeer or shepherds. There's also apparently a more complex version of the game where you can also have sleds and fences and things like that. This hasn't been that well documented. And in the ethnographic pictures, it has been, or ethnographic research from 100 years ago, it has been contextualized more as a form of seeing the future, sort of imagining how your reindeer herd will grow in the future. But perhaps now, looking at the pictures, we could also interpret it as more like a storytelling game in a sense. And of course, these also can be interconnected. They don't need to exist by themselves. The middle picture is a picture of a game called Sasku from Karelia. And I just got this picture a couple of weeks ago from a museum in the east of Finland, the Imatra City Museum, who have collections of the municipality in Karelia, which were, after the Second World War, were the Soviet Union took those over. So apparently there's been also play of a game called Sasku, which I hadn't heard of before in Karelia. The first sort of looking into this really quickly, the idea came that maybe this is related to the game of Russian draughts, which is called the shaski. There's a similarity here, but we don't know. So these games exist. And there also exist board games in museum collections. Here's just a couple of examples. And these haven't been interpreted. We don't really, I guess, know exactly what was played with these boards. But of course, we could have some ideas what they were used for. But this isn't my main concern today. This is just to show you that these games also exist in Finland. The archaeological finds, the materiality of traditional games. But games also became products, commercially released products, in the 1800s. And this is an image of Hilda Olson, who was actually the first Finnish game designer. She led a very atypical life for a woman of her times. She was born in Ny Karleby, Ostrobotnia, moved to Helsinki for studies, painting studies, was on a research trip to the Crimea, where she was doing painting biological specimen, and later moved to London, where she became a tapestry designer. But during her time in Helsinki, she also designed games, at least 3 games. The first of them, called Lustfärd, Avasaksa, Huvimatka Aavasaksaan, which was published in 2 languages in 1862, is apparently the oldest Finnish game. And we will look at the game a little bit closer. She was the designer when she grew up in Ostrobotnia, Ny Karleby. She was acquainted with one of the key sort of liberal nationalistic figures of Finland, Sakari Topelius. And she was a bit younger, but the family is associated. And clearly she was very, very knowledgeable about the nationalistic movement. Because at that time, Finland didn't really exist as a nation, and it hadn't existed as a nation. It was first part of Sweden, the eastern province of Sweden, and in 1809 it became a part of Russia, an autonomous part of Russia. But during the 1800s, sort of the idea of Finland as a nation started to grow, Finns as a people, and of course that had to be constructed, had to be built up. Finland has traditionally had a very, very strong association with Sweden. Many people have been Swedish-speaking, still are. I'm one of them. So kind of connections to the West were very had a long history, but also during this time, of course, we got a lot of influence from the East, from Russia as well. And this has been quite traditional in Finland, of course, that this has been a melting pot in a way. The game, like all games at the time, was sold in an envelope that included the board, which was printed on paper, and the booklet, the rules booklet. It didn't have any gaming pieces, any dice, and this was the way games were published for still 60 years after this. It's during the First World War that the first board game from Finland published in a box came out. that we know. And sort of thinking about the talks we heard earlier today, this is kind of interesting because those are the pieces that were actually missing from the archaeological evidence. There we only find the dice and the game pieces. So people were expected to use their own dice, their own material from home to play these games. And for example, this is a game of the goose, a racing game where you throw the dice, you move around, and then you take out the booklet, you read small stories about different places in Finland, and then you either lose coins or gain coins. And people are expected to use their actual coins in playing this. And maybe this might also be connected to the fact that Finland had just got its own currency, the markka, and apparently there were a lot of Russian coins lying around that could then be used for playing. I would call this a very pedagogical game. The title of the game, or the subtitle, is actually that it says it's a nytt barnspel in Swedish, which is like new game for kids. Other games of the period or later games, they don't really talk about who is expected to play these, but this game says it. And this is, for me, quite interesting. It's very pedagogical in the sense that it's sort of building up the idea of what Finland is, and it's also teaching things about the different regions. It's interesting in that the places you travel around in are actually kind of in the center of Finland, instead of in the west, which was a very traditionally Swedish-influenced region, or in the areas that were part of the autonomous republic at the time. So you kind of have this, against, I interpret this as a kind of balancing act between Russian influence and Swedish influence. And it was also a news game. It deals very much with new things. The railway had just been built between Helsinki, the capital, and Hämeenlinna just a couple of years earlier, and the game talks about that, to sort of educate people. It talks about coffee, which just a couple of years earlier, it had been de-rationalized, so you could buy coffee, and it was becoming a trend in Finland. It talks about the markka coins that just came out. It talks about a lot of very modern things, modern for the times. So yes, interesting game, and I guess in some ways typical, because many other games from the period also dealt with contemporary things. If there was a war between nations, for example, Russia, the mother country of the time, and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War, there were actually 3 games that came out in Finland during the war. One of them is Urholin and Port Arthur, like brave Port Arthur being one of the key clashes in the war. There's a game called Risti ja Puolikuu, which is like Cross and Crescent Moon, which is about the war between Turkey and Greece, and it came out when the war was on. The game about the Russo-Japanese War came out just as the war was fought. And this is the first game about the Russo-Japanese War, and this is kind of rooting for Russian troops. It's very nationalistic, like Russian nationalistic. But as we know, the war didn't go that well for Russia, and the later games sort of reflect that quite a lot. So Russian troops are being dealt with more critically, sort of it becomes more of a sort of, I guess, documentary in the sense that both the Japanese forces and the Russian forces are seen as potential winners. So there were many games dealing with war. These are just some examples. There's lots and lots more that were dealing with contemporary wars. There was also other games dealing with contemporary issues, like the game Nordenskjöld in Koillisväylä, the what's it called, like the northeastern passage of Nordenskjöld, who was a Swedish explorer. So there was a game about that came out in Finland, which might have been also exported to Sweden, but very, very possibly. And it's a game that came out during, because the trip was very difficult. It went above or north of Siberia, and the ships had or were stuck in the ice for one winter and couldn't move on. And what's surprising is that the game is actually published during the trip. During the time that the explorers are still somewhere in this region, they hadn't really come home yet. So all this is fiction. The later half of the game is fiction, and you can kind of see it in the text where the player is imagined to be married to a Javanese princess or something like that, whereas the earlier ones are much more documentary and sort of talking about the life on the ice sheets in the North Sea. So yes, documentary games. Apparently, it was possible to make this game with images from the actual trip, because while the ships were stuck in the ice, they sent out one like dog sled with illustrations and letters that then came to Finland at some point. So, yes, games were dealing with contemporary events, and I would call them, many of these, like news games that were clearly conveying information of things that were going on. And maybe we could say that they worked together with newspapers at the times, and we know that newspapers were published without pictures until, like, earliest pictures in newspapers come from 1920s in Finland. So for a long time, a newspaper was just text. And perhaps these games could complement that. And we know that newspapers often, especially in rural areas, were read together in villages. So one person by candlelight was reading a letter to everybody else, and there was a discussion. Maybe these games had a similar audience. People came together to understand contemporary events. Maybe, we don't know. We don't have sources about it. So many games were news games. But other games weren't news games. And we can see, for example, games with science fiction elements, like in the game Resan till solen, Matkustus aurinkoon, where you're traveling to the sun in a sort of Jules Vernean way. Or games dealing with popular pastimes. And of course, the topics of the games also talk about the intended audience maybe a little bit, because there's two examples of sailing here, Kappseglingen till Kytö and Kilpa purjehduspeli, which actually has hexagons, published in 1906, which is kind of interesting because it was kind of rare, and hexagons start to appear more frequently in games in maybe 1950s in strategy games. So this is a very early example of that. But this maybe talk about the intended audience as well, because sailing was an upper-class, Swedish-speaking pastime. And perhaps we could say that these games were made for a similar audience. And also, coming back to the topic of war, when Finland had a civil war, a very bloody civil war in 1918, there were 3 games of the war published during the war. And already, I told you about the first game that was published in a box. It's actually shown here. This is a game called Maailmansota läntisellä sotanäyttämöllä, The World War on the Western Front, published in a box 1914, when the war had just started. There was actually a sequel. There was actually a sequel of the Eastern Front War as well, published, I think, a year after. These were like simple strategy games, like hidden troop games, like the French game of Attack, where you don't really know the quality of the troops you're facing, and then you have to deduct what kind of forces you're facing, and sort of it's artillery beats infantry type of game, and infantry beats horses, or whatever the logic is in the end. Yes, so during the war there was a lot of games about the First World War, but also particularly about the Finnish Civil War. There's a game called Suomen vapaussota, the Freedom War of Finland, which is very much on the side of the whites who won the war. It's a very sort of jingoistic game, I guess, even that portrays the war as a very successful and important fight for some of the people in Finland. But there's another game called Punaisten ja valkoisten taistelu Suomessa in the middle, which translates to the fight between the Reds and Whites in Finland 1918, which is maybe a bit more balanced. And it's an interesting game in the sense that it also understands the influence of the foreign troops on the war. And it sees the war as a part of the First World War. So you have German troops coming from Germany and Russian troops coming from Russia who are that are also influencing the events. It's again a strategy game, a simple strategy game. You can see that the thicker lines are railways and the lighter lines are roads, and you have two types of troops. You have artillery and infantry, and artillery can't move on the thinner lines, which makes infantry sort of more versatile, but the artillery is stronger. But it's still quite a lot a dice game. So you throw the dice and you move a troop, and if you have like extra pips, you can make the other forces smaller. And also, some of the places on the map have events that influence the game. So historical events that took part, for example, here in Tampere, allow you to get or lose troops, or historical events in Helsinki allow. So it's kind of like a combination of a game of the goose, like the earlier one, the Huvimatka Aavasaksaan, the first Finnish game, and a sort of fairly simple strategy game, but still a game that has more of a strategy element maybe than a game like this. Yes. There's also a third game that was published in a magazine, and that was also quite popular way of publishing, that you had the back of the magazine was actually a game board that you were supposed to cut out and use for playing. And also a fourth game that I've also only seen the advertisement for. It's a game called Rauhanpeli, Game of Peace, and Jaakko Suominen also talks about this game in his fairly new book. It's a game for peace, which says, koska tulee rauha, when will peace come? And it says that you can figure this out by playing the game. We don't know anything more about the game. Yes. Okay, so there was quite an active game scene, many games coming out already quite early. And there's, looking at the collections of the National Library, other museums in Finland, so in the 1800s, early 1900s, there were roughly like almost 100 games that we know of that came out during this period. So quite a lot of material. If we, on the other hand, look at pictures in, for example, museum collections, we will see something else. And these are just some examples of people playing. There's again, ethnographic pictures. This is from a research trip to Karelia, Luvajärvi, where people are playing kyykkä, which is a game where you throw sticks. This is still played in modern Finland as well. It's an awesome set of 10 pictures or something where you can really see how fun the players had when they were playing that. There's also quite a lot of pictures of play if you look at early photographs of sort of the well-to-do families. This is from the set of pictures from the Notbeck family who were running the factory, the Finlayson factory here in Tampere. They were living very affluently next to the factory, and in the pictures you will see some pictures of games as well. Here, chess. One of the earliest pictures from Tampere, actually. But also some other types of games. This is a very beautiful picture, apparently from Helsinki, with people playing kirppupeli, tiddlywinks. No idea if this was a published product. I haven't seen it anywhere, or whether they just sort of, or whether it was made by them. But still, very, very beautiful picture. And we start to see in the late 1800s also lots of pictures of clearly well-to-do families playing cards, often outdoors. Outdoors, maybe for technical reasons, it's much easier to take pictures outside. But it also seemed to be a thing in other ways. And if you look at early 1900s pictures, there starts to come out lots and lots of these. Or there's lots and lots of pictures of people playing cards in museum collections, for example. Clearly, playing cards was part of a nice day in the summer outside. Maybe not with the weather we're having now, but hopefully in a month or two we will see this. And we don't really know the reason why people were, or we also see a lot of people clearly playing out in the woods. And we don't really know of a reason, but maybe it had to do with the stigma of gambling in Finland at the time. Gambling was frowned upon. So if you wanted to play, you went away from sort of organized society, you went into the woods where you could play, and there's lots of oral histories about this as well. There's, you know, in local histories, like a particular area of the forest is the gambling forest or the playing forest, etc. And it's sort of, this was clearly a trope. So then we also see pictures like this, which is not taken outside. It's taken in a studio and atelier, and people are playing. Young boys are playing, clearly mimicking sort of this very, very prestigious thing, maybe, to gamble in the woods. And this is another beautiful picture with kind of like the same idea that playing cards is something that adults do while drinking, while having fun. This is, again, clearly quite young people putting on a show. So there's hundreds of pictures like this. Suddenly, maybe it has to do with the fact that photography was getting more common, but probably also cards were distributed more also in like in all layers of society. Finland was going through some economics booms at the time as well, so society was getting richer. People could buy cards from the store, and we know of cards of the time that they probably wouldn't last that many games. It was probably you bought a pack of cards, you could play like 10 games and the pack would be destroyed. The quality wasn't that good. At the same time, or even a bit earlier, we start to see lots of versions of Old Maid and Happy Families in Finland. And this is a game you could play with a normal pack of cards, but in we start to see some cards like this in the late 1800s that were apparently imported from Sweden, but then also in the early 1900s there starts to be lots and lots of these also made in Finland, and often sort of quite jokingly talking about the different work people can do, for example, or animals doing the work of humans, for example. This is just one side of the cards, and I guess I'll give a content warning about the next slide because it's going to include some racist imagery. Because these also started to sort of show maybe the not so, especially from a more modern viewpoint, the positive, not so positive aspects of society of the times. Very, very racist portrayals of sort of the Black Peter figure often being black in a racist depiction. And also kind of another thing may be connected, maybe not. We start to see games where sort of the different families are different nationalities. So the Finns are sporty bunch, and their allies, the Nazi Germans, as you see, come from the flags, are sausage loving people, or games like the army game, which is a similar game, also showing kind of the different nationalities, the different armies. Yes, this again, at least dozens, probably even hundreds of different packs like this coming out then and also later. And it's interesting also from a modern perspective because this racist figure kind of became kind of like a symbol. And when in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, more and more people started pointing that out, that this is probably, like these packs were still sold. You probably, maybe you could change the imagery here a bit. It became kind of a big discussion also in Finnish media. And you can still, you're still able to buy some of these versions where they maybe dropped just musta from the title, and now it's the Pekka-peli, and it apparently doesn't have that much to do with reality, but still the sort of racist image stays. So yes, we talked about games and war already earlier, and this is another, World War II is another period where you will see a lot of games in pictures and also published games. Finland went through the World War in three separate wars. First the Winter War, which was fairly quick, but then came the Continuation War, which was much longer. And you can see that in the pictures, because there's clearly soldiers are having a lot of time on the front playing cards. But you also start to see other types of games. For example, here, Taistelu Karjalasta, Kampen om Karelen, the fight for Karelia, which is in the collections of the National Library, I'm pretty sure. So it's a strategy game about the war that people are playing while they have free time at the front, which is maybe surprising, maybe a bit weird as well. And you start to see things like this. Clearly, some of these games were invented by soldiers, maybe even when they had they were spending time on the front. This is from an article series in Suomen Kuvalehti dealing with X-peli, which is an abstract game. The article says it's a game like chess, but it's more simpler, so it's suited for all soldiers on the front. There's also many other games. Here are just some examples, and these didn't only come out during the war, but also you can see some games already in the 1930s, which are maybe sort of preparing people for the times to come. There's a game called Manöveripeli, the maneuver game, which has a map of Finland and then different troops. For example, the Kaasujoukot, the gas commando in Swedish, the gas troops shooting apparently using the gas as a weapon. There's a game called Syöksypommituspeli, like the dive bombing game, which is a game where you put the game board on the floor and then you drop bombs on the board. You're supposed to hit the red targets and not hit the blue areas, which are churches and libraries and museums. So there's similar games from Germany, Nazi Germany, and the United States that I've been able to find on Board Game Geek. So apparently this wasn't an isolated thing, but this very much is made in Finland. The cover actually has a Stuka, a dive bomber on it. So games like this. And then there's lots of games which are kind of more strategic, tactical, like Korsupeli, for example, or the Partio Kahakka game. And again, we don't really know who made these games, but based on the pictures, based on some isolated articles, maybe many of them were actually invented on the front by soldiers. And already we talked about the X-peli, but there's another game, Asemasota, which is also kind of like a similar game to the First World War game, a game of hidden troops, which portrays a fictional place, but a place which very much reminds one of Karelia with the place names and etc. And it depicts a war between the Reds and the Blues. It doesn't really talk about who is fighting here, but clearly it came out in the 1940s when the war was going on, and it clearly depicts a war between Finland and the Soviet Union. But this was a game that was apparently thought to be aimed at children. There's a couple of commercials of it. One is in a magazine Jouluille that was published for no, it's not the magazine. Sorry, it's in the catalog of publisher Kuvataide, and it's shown with other sort of games clearly aimed at children. And one of the commercials even says that this is a game where kids can learn about the war. So this was part of the militarization of society in Finland. Kids at home were learning how to fight through games. Yes, and again a content warning for the next slide, because games were also quite verbal about what was going on, quite clear about what was going on. This is a game called Ristiretki Bolshevismia vastaan, which is translated to Crusade Against Bolshevism, where Finland is clearly shown to be on the side of Nazi Germany. And this is very much different from what you see in sort of history writing later on, or even the media climate of the times. Everybody was talking about a sort of separate war that Finland was fighting against the Soviet Union, and it just happened to be on the side of Nazi Germany. But this game clearly shows a very different understanding of what was going on. It's an area control game. Okay, so games and war have clearly a connection, and have had a connection for a long time. But when we come to closer to modern times, games kind of seem to change. The perceived audience of games seem to change. Now we see, for example, pictures or advertisements aimed clearly at kids. And games are sort of moving away from a depiction of reality to a depiction of fantasy. So we have iconic games like Afrikan Tähti, the Star of Africa, like this, which is a colonial dream of Africa and exploring Africa with kind of racist imagery, and it's still a sort of loved Finnish game, and there's been a discussion also around it, whether they sort of, because the point of the game is to go to Africa, and it has hidden chips, so you don't really know where the great diamond of Africa is, and you try to find it by turning over these chips. You can fly, you can use boats, etc. So it's a very sort of advanced game. It's not only a sort of dice rolling goose game, but it has lots of different tactical elements, and it kind of tells stories. But it's the discussion about the sort of problematic aspect of the game are still going on. There's also similar games with other themes, like a game about the Moomin Valley that came out a couple of years later, clearly a similar game, and a game that Tove Jansson, the inventor of the Moomins, was herself involved in. She painted the game board together with her brother and made up the rules. Sadly, there's still versions of this game in stores, but sadly the original artwork has disappeared. We don't know where it is. Or we have games like dealing with science fiction and space exploration and things like this. Often very fairly simple games, goose games, or in some cases with sort of more complex elements, like in the Afrikan Tähti and the Moomin game.
Niklas, there's 15 minutes left, more or
Yeah, okay. So I've been taking my time, but I will rush through a couple of more slides to show some things, and then we hopefully have time for a couple of questions. So, yes, games are sort of moving away from imagery of war, but they're still dealing with contemporary issues. And here's just a couple of examples from the 70s. With, for example, the Kaupunkipeli, the game of the city, sort of apparently teaching people coming from outside the cities how cities operate. You're supposed to go to stores and get stuff, and you're training sort of to use different methods of transport in the city, etc. Or games like Miniloop dealing with computers, how computers operate. Or games like Ulotaxi dealing with the sort of technical innovations in radio technology and taxis in the 70s. And we start to see also a lot of advertisement games where clearly the publisher is trying to advertise something, and many companies in Finland making these. And these still exist, at least in Finland and probably also many other places. So we have games like Skop Bank of Finland, which is made by a bank sort of advertisement, their work in the selling around the world competition, whatever it's called, etc., etc. And we also see a lot of games with a clearly educational purpose published by NGOs or even state bodies. So we have Hälytys 112, which is about the new emergency number coming out in the 90s. Or sexual game dealing with issues related to sexual education, or Käypä hoito seurapeli, which is deals with the proper care of patients in hospitals. And also, sort of at the same time, we start to see both more sort of Hollywood-like ideas for games made in Finland. For example, James Bond 007 by Risto Hietä and Taistelurekka by Pasi Janhunen, who are both also or are still role-playing game designers and taking in this sort of Ameritrash story-based, movie imagery-based aesthetics. And at the same time, other games are coming from abroad, especially Sweden. And looking at the pictures, we kind of see this climate where very different types of people are playing these games. I'm going to rush through the rest of the slides to have some time also for questions, but maybe just to show of a couple of things still towards the end. When we come to the 2000s, we also start to see a lot of discussion related to the sort of social role of games, and we start to see games that clearly have a societal critique as part of them, like Myytti, Väinämöisen tarina, which is kind of like a deconstruction of how Finnish art from 100 years ago was made, and it kind of shows the influences, and it breaks down the myths of sort of the genius Finnish painter making this imagery. Or the new version of Afrikan tähti, clearly distancing itself from the problematic colonialist imagery. Or games like Lapin Hippu, who take as their starting point the Afrikan tähti game, but use it as a social critique of the situation of the Sami people in northern Finland and how mining operations in Finland threaten the place. Okay. Maybe this is enough for today. Here are the links I promised, and we still have time for some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Niklas. I think it's also a wonderful preparation for the industrial panel that we will have later today, in which we will discuss the current production of games. We have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
No, it seems.
Okay. Thank you very much. I just wanted to add that many of the aspects you underlined are very typical for European, for the market, the commercialized priority games in Europe, also in Central Europe. For example, the interest in actual events in the 19th century and the early 20th century, not only in the wars, but also in the expeditions. There are games about Nansen's expedition to the North Pole. There is a game about André's expedition to the North Pole, which was published even before he parted with the balloon and ended up tragically. The Russian-Japanese War. There is also a game that has been published in Germany about this. So this whole interest in the actual events, this is quite typical, very typical, and also the. That after World War II, there were more games about new ideas and new technological developments, but also a shift away from actual themes and to fantasy themes, things like that. And of course, the many board games on World War II. There's a big collection in the Netherlands of these games. They were produced in Germany, in France, in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere. I published several years ago an article about World War I games. All these games that were published, not all, but some of these games that were published during 1914 and 1918 that had World War I as a subject. I wanted to know, apart from nowadays, do you know if whether or not Finnish games manufacturers had any contacts or collaborations with the Central European games editors? For example, German games editors and elsewhere.
Nowadays or historically? Did you mean now or
No, around 1900, in the beginning of the 20th century, something like that.
No direct accounts of this, and I also been looking at the games published in other countries, and clearly there's similarities between the topics, and clearly there's a movement going on. But I haven't found, or there's really rare examples of games that were actually exported and imported to another country. So these were like Finland made games for Finns, but they were very close to German games, for example. Okay. But there was just like a couple of games that traveled from one country to another, and Monopoly and a game called Electra from the early 1900s are just a couple of examples I've been able to find. So all other games were made here, which is interesting, but clearly they were influencing each other in some way.
Thank you so much. On one of your slides there was a question, are these games for children or adults? And this is something I also struggle with when looking at historical games. So I wonder, can you name a date round about when the boxes of the games have these notes like from 6 to 99 years? Can you date it when this starts?
I think that's a phenomenon that starts after the Second World War. I can't recall any instances of that from the period before. And clearly, because the topic matter is quite heavy in some of the games, clearly they weren't only intended for children. Maybe they also had an adult audience, and this is very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. You at the start of the talk you mentioned that in the early time game publishers were not required to place a legal deposit at the National Library. When did that start, and was there any discussion about games as cultural heritage and worthy of collecting?
This is a very, very recent phenomenon, and the National Library has been quite active in later years in sort of underlining that games have always and are part of the legal deposit. If you look at their collections, they somehow got quite a lot of games in the early 1800s, and even some design versions of games apparently donated by the publishing houses. But then in like late 1800s, publishers started thinking that, okay, the legal deposit isn't concerning us. And I've been talking to sort of old school board game publishers from Finland who were kind of proud of the fact that they they didn't have to do that because that's like the legal deposit is like, is it like 6 copies? Yes. So yeah, so they were kind of proud that they didn't have to send like those 6 and they could sell them and make a profit. So clearly it changed quite a lot, and sort of talking to these old-time game publishers, I kind of get the understanding that especially after the Second World War, game publishing was thought of as a way to make quick money and put out quite sort of easily made like dice games out there, whereas maybe before the situation was a little bit different. Maybe, but again, we don't really have any sources for this, so this is all sort of from very, very small pieces putting together. Do we still have time for questions?
Oh yeah, I've got one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk, Niklas. I just want to know a little bit more about the state-based repression of games in Finland. Did it also extend to kind of not liking dice in general, as well as cards?
The gambling discussion. I don't know. Yeah, would be interesting to look deeper into this. Probably because the thing that was frowned upon was gambling in itself. Sort of, yeah. So probably yes. But this, what we see in the pictures is that people were often gambling with cards, or usually gambling with cards. I don't recall seeing any picture with people throwing dice. So maybe that's just kind of like a coincidence that gambling took the form of card play in Finland.
Time for maybe one last question?
Yep.
Yeah, I actually had the same sort of question regarding the gambling stuff, so I can actually.
Okay.
Let's ask something different.
Do we still have questions here?
So great presentation, thank you. I think it actually speaks to the essence of the ephemerality and the disappearance, and so the archival work you all do is amazing. Maybe it's a softball, but can you talk a bit about also, I mean, you did a little bit some more about talking to Finnish game makers and actually getting that information from them for your archive?
Yeah, this is something that we try to do nowadays, and I think that the thinking has shifted quite a lot. Maybe like the Finnish Museum of Games is part of this shift towards actually understanding games as something that we should preserve and understand better. So nowadays we do have these links, and many publishers send games also to us, not only the National Library, and sort of they are proud of the work they have been doing, and they want it to be remembered. But this is like the, I guess, younger generation of board game designers in their 40s and lower. But before that, board game publishing in Finland was very much like a hit-and-run business, I guess, where you took like the games weren't finished in the way that games nowadays maybe are and play tested. They were just like printed out there with an interesting topic and often quite simple dice games that aren't like tactically interesting in the way that modern games are. But of course, that's the way they used to be, and they were very much aimed at kids.
Okay, thank you very much, Niklas.
Thank you.